Chapter 1: The Anniversary. Ethan adjusted the collar of his shirt as he sat at the dimly lit cafe, waiting. The place was luxurious yet had a certain gloom to it. Dark wood furniture, dim chandeliers casting soft golden light, and quiet instrumental music playing in the background. It was supposed to be a romantic setting, but to him, it felt suffocating. Across from him, Sophie beamed with excitement. She reached across the table, holding his hand with both of hers. "Can you believe it's been a year already?" she said, her voice filled with joy. "We've been through so much together, and I know we'll only grow stronger. Right, Ethan?" He forced a smile, nodding mechanically. "Yeah, a year." His heart wasn't in it. Not anymore. For the past few months, Ethan had been struggling with a realization that terrified him. He no longer loved Sophie. And worse, it wasn't because he had fallen for someone else. It was because he had fallen for him. The weight of this truth crushed him. He had spent nights staring at his ceiling, trying to convince himself otherwise. He had tried to ignore the way his heart raced when Ryan smiled at him in class, or how his thoughts always drifted back to that one night they spent talking for hours. Sophie noticed his distant expression. She tilted her head, concern creeping into her soft brown eyes. "Ethan, is something wrong?" He swallowed. He couldn't lie to her anymore. After paying the bill, they walked outside, the cool night air hitting them. The street was mostly empty, dimly lit by flickering streetlights. A strange unease settled in Ethan's stomach, but he ignored it. There were more important things to focus on. He had to end this. They reached his apartment building, standing just beneath his balcony. Sophie turned to him, a hopeful look on her face. "I had such a great time tonight. Maybe this weekend we can—" "Sophie." His voice was firm. "We need to talk." She blinked. "Oh, okay, what is it?" A deep breath. I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry, but I don't love you the way I used to." Silence. The distant hum of traffic was the only sound between them. Sophie laughed nervously. "What? Ethan, that's not funny." "I'm not joking." Her smile faded. "Wait, you're serious?" He nodded. She took a step back, shaking her head. "Why? Is it something I did?" Her voice wavered. "We can fix this, Ethan. I love you. It's not something that can be fixed." His throat tightened. "I'm sorry." Tears welled in her eyes. No, please don't do this." She grabbed his arm, desperation in her grip. "We've been through so much. You promised me. Sophie, let go." He pulled away. She stared at him, breathing heavily, tears streaming down her face. Then, without another word, she turned and ran. Ethan watched as she disappeared into the darkness. A part of him wanted to call out, to chase after her, but he didn't. Instead, he exhaled shakily, guilt pressing heavily on his chest. It was over. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on his nightstand. 11:59 p.m. He turned onto his side, reaching for his phone. His mind raced with memories. Sophie's smile, her laughter, the way she looked at him tonight before running off. He felt awful, but deep down he knew he had done the right thing. Ding, a notification. He frowned, unlocking his phone. Message from Sophie. His breath caught in his throat. He hesitated before opening it. The screen was filled with static. Then, through the distorted noise, a voice recording played. A whisper. "You can't leave me, Ethan." His heart slammed against his chest. The recording cut off. Then, a knock at the window. Ethan froze. His apartment was on the 4th floor. Slowly, with shaking hands, he turned his head toward the balcony. A shadow stood just outside, watching him. Chapter 2: Midnight Visitor. Ethan's breath hitched. His body went rigid as he stared at the shadowy figure standing outside his balcony door. The dim glow from the streetlights barely illuminated its form, but he knew someone or something was watching him. His mind raced. He lived on the 4th floor. No one could be standing there. It was impossible. Then, another knock. Soft, almost impatient. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. He sat up slowly, reaching for his phone. His fingers trembled as he turned on the flashlight. The moment the light hit the glass, the figure was gone. The empty balcony stared back at him, its white railing gleaming under the streetlights. The air outside was still, quiet. Had he imagined it? His pulse pounded in his ears as he hesitantly stood up, walking towards the sliding door. Every step felt heavier, as if unseen hands were gripping his ankles. He placed his palm against the cold glass and peered outside. Nothing. The street below was deserted. A few parked cars, dim apartment windows, and the occasional flickering street lamp. No sign of her. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I'm just tired, stressed, that's all." He locked the balcony door, just in case, then climbed back into bed. His phone was still in his hand. The message from Sophie was there, waiting. His thumb hovered over the play button. He shouldn't listen to it again, but his curiosity burned. Taking a deep breath, he tapped the screen. "You can't leave me, Ethan!" The whisper was distorted, unnatural. The way she said his name, it sounded almost wrong. Suddenly, his phone screen glitched. The screen went black, then flickered. A blurry image appeared. A selfie. His stomach lurched. It was Sophie. Her face was pale, wet streaks of tears running down her cheeks. But what made his blood run cold was her eyes. They were wide, too wide, as if she wasn't just crying, she was terrified. And then something even worse. Just over her shoulder, in the darkness behind her, a hand, thin, pale, fingers curling slightly, reaching for her. Ethan threw the phone across the bed. His breathing was erratic. His chest felt tight. "What the hell is happening?" he whispered. He needed to calm down, think rationally. Maybe Sophie had sent that picture earlier, and he just didn't notice. Maybe it was a prank, some twisted joke she was playing to make him feel guilty. Yeah, that had to be it. His eyes flickered to the clock. 12:13 a.m. He forced himself to lie back down, pulling the blanket over his shoulders. His body was still tense, but exhaustion was creeping in. Just sleep. It's just in your head. He closed his eyes. A noise. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He listened. Drip, drip, drip. Frowning, he turned toward the sound. It was coming from the bathroom. His throat went dry. He hadn't used the sink. Slowly, he sat up again, his entire body on edge. The apartment was silent except for the rhythmic dripping. The more he listened, the more it sounded off. Too slow, too heavy, like something thicker than water. His gut told him not to move, to stay in bed, to ignore it, but his shaking legs carried him forward anyway. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. His trembling hand reached for the light switch, and with one deep breath, he flicked it on. The light buzzed to life. Ethan's stomach twisted violently. The sink was full. Dark red water swirling slowly, circling the drain but never going down. His breath came in short gasps. He stepped closer. His reflection in the mirror looked just as shaken as he felt. Then, a shadow moved behind him. His heart nearly burst out of his chest. He spun around. Nothing. The bathroom was empty. But then as he turned back to the mirror, the reflection wasn't. Sophie stood behind him in the mirror, face pale, eyes black, lips curled into a chilling smile. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Ethan couldn't move. And then, she lunged at him. The light exploded. The room went dark. Ethan screamed. Chapter 3, The Unfinished Goodbye. Ethan's scream echoed through the darkness. His body stumbled backward, hitting the bathroom wall as his breath came in ragged gasps. Then, silence. The darkness pressed against him, suffocating. The air was thick, heavy, as if the very room had been swallowed by an unseen force. His pulse thundered in his ears. No, this isn't real, he muttered, squeezing his eyes shut. He fumbled along the wall, searching blindly for the light switch. His fingers trembled as they slid across cold tile, until finally they found the switch. With a flick, the light came back on. Ethan's breath hitched. The bathroom was empty. The sink was normal. No more dark red water. No sign of Sophie. The mirror reflected only his own terrified face. His skin was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Had he imagined it? His body shook violently as he backed out of the bathroom, slamming the door. He needed to get out of here. Grabbing his phone, he checked the time. 12:26 a.m. A shiver crawled down his spine. He needed air, and now. Ethan threw on a jacket and left his apartment, hurrying down the dimly lit staircase. The air outside was cool, but the unease in his chest didn't fade. His mind raced. That wasn't just a hallucination. It felt real. The dripping sink, the shadow, her reflection in the mirror. He needed to clear his head. His feet carried him through the quiet streets. He barely registered where he was going, until he stopped in front of a familiar place. The cafe. The same one where he had broken up with Sophie just hours ago. It was closed now. The inside dark, but something felt wrong. The streetlights around it flickered, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. The wind had stopped blowing, and the night was too silent. Then his phone vibrated. He flinched, staring at the screen. Unknown number. His fingers hovered over the answer button. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore it, but his shaking hands betrayed him. He pressed answer. At first, there was only static, then breathing, slow, shaky, familiar. His throat tightened. Sophie! More breathing, and then a whisper. You never said goodbye. Ethan's stomach dropped. A chilling breeze suddenly rushed past him, sending ice-cold shivers down his spine. He turned instinctively. Across the street, beneath a flickering lamppost, she was standing there, Sophie. Her long hair was unkempt, strands falling over her face. Her white dress was stained, dark patches spreading from her chest down to her hands. But her eyes, black, empty, hollow. She tilted her head slowly, staring at him without blinking. Ethan's breath hitched. His legs refused to move. Then, she took a step forward. The streetlight above her flickered violently. Another step. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. Run. But he couldn't. He wanted to turn, to sprint away. But his body felt frozen in place. Sophie's lips curled into a soft, sad smile. Ethan, you left me. Her voice echoed in his head, though her mouth barely moved. Another step. The shadows around her deepened. The ground beneath her feet seemed wrong, as if the pavement was distorting, warping. Ethan finally broke free from the paralysis. He turned on his heels and ran. Don't look back. Don't look back. His breaths came in sharp gasps as his feet pounded against the pavement. The streets were eerily empty, as if the entire city had vanished. His apartment. He had to get back to his apartment. But as he rounded the corner, he stopped cold. Sophie was there, standing just ahead of him, the same sad smile. "You can't leave me, Ethan." A choked gasp escaped his throat. "No, this is impossible." He stumbled back, his legs nearly giving out. Sophie lifted her hand slowly, reaching toward him. "Come back to me." A searing pain shot through his skull. Images flashed before his eyes. Sophie crying, Sophie screaming, Sophie falling, her body hitting the ground. And then, blood everywhere. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His vision blurred, his fingers dug into the pavement. Sophie's voice whispered in his ears, surrounding him, crawling under his skin. "You left me to die." Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he clutched his head. No, I didn't. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the voices to stop. When he finally opened them, Sophie was gone. The street was empty. The air was silent. But Ethan knew she wasn't finished with him, and she wouldn't stop. Not until she got what she wanted. Chapter 4. The Scratches on the Door. Ethan barely remembered how he got back to his apartment. His legs had carried him on instinct, fueled by sheer panic. Now, as he stood in front of his door, panting heavily, sweat clinging to his skin, he hesitated. Something felt off. The hallway was eerily quiet. The air was thick, as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. The dim overhead light flickered weakly. Then his eyes fell on the door. His breath caught in his throat. Long, deep scratches covered the wood, fresh, jagged, like claw marks. He reached out with a trembling hand, running his fingers over the grooves. The cuts were deep, uneven, desperate. His stomach twisted. Had someone tried to get in? Or worse, had something tried to get out? A chill crept down his spine. He fumbled for his keys, his fingers shaking violently. As he pushed the key into the lock, he hesitated again. What if she was inside? What if he wasn't alone anymore? The thought sent a wave of nausea through him, but there was nowhere else to go. Taking a deep breath, he turned the key and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, silent. Ethan stepped inside cautiously, his senses on high alert. The air smelled slightly different, damp, rotten. He turned on the light. Nothing seemed out of place. His furniture was exactly as he left it. His laptop sat on the table, his jacket still draped over the chair. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave him. Then a sound, a faint scratching. His blood ran cold. It was coming from the bedroom. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing his feet to move forward. The wooden floor creaked beneath him as he made his way toward the slightly ajar door. With each step, the scratching grew louder, more frantic, more hungry. His breath came in short gasps. He reached the doorway, heart hammering against his ribs. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The room was dark. The only light came from the street outside, casting faint, shifting shadows across the walls. Ethan's eyes darted around. Nothing seemed out of place, until his gaze fell on the closet door. It was half open, and from inside, The scratching continued. His body went rigid. The darkness inside the closet seemed too deep, too unnatural. Then, a whisper. Ethan. His stomach twisted violently. He should run. He should run. But his feet moved forward instead. His hand trembled as he reached for the closet door. With a deep breath, he grabbed the handle and yanked it open. Nothing. The closet was empty. His clothes hung neatly, untouched. The shelves were undisturbed. But Ethan knew what he had heard. He took a shaky step back, exhaling slowly. Maybe he was losing his mind. Maybe the lack of sleep, the stress, maybe it was all catching up to him. Then his eyes drifted downward. His heart stopped. Deep bloody scratches covered the inside of the closet door. He stumbled back, his breath hitching. His vision blurred as panic clawed at his throat. His phone vibrated. The sound nearly made him jump out of his skin. With shaking hands, he pulled it out of his pocket. Unknown number. His fingers hovered over the screen. He shouldn't answer, but he knew he would. His thumb hesitated, then pressed accept. At first there was only static, then the breathing. Slow, uneven, familiar. Ethan's chest tightened. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie? Silence. Then the whisper came again. Ethan, let me in. The call ended. Ethan's entire body locked up. Then the closet door slammed shut on its own. The lamp beside his bed flickered violently, casting erratic shadows on the walls. A wave of dread washed over him. He was not alone. A faint sound reached his ears. Soft, slow, dripping. His head snapped towards the bathroom. The sink, again. But this time, it wasn't just water. A single bloody handprint was smeared across the mirror, and underneath it, in jagged, dripping letters, "You never said goodbye." Ethan's scream tore through the night. Chapter 5. The Balcony Whisper. Ethan's scream died in his throat, replaced by the sound of his own ragged breathing. His legs trembled as he backed away from the bathroom. His wide eyes locked on the bloody message smeared across the mirror. "You never said goodbye." His stomach churned. This isn't real. This isn't real. But the cold sweat on his skin, the rapid thudding of his heart, it felt real. His hands clenched into fists. He needed to get out. He turned sharply, rushing towards the front door. Bang! The door slammed shut before he could even reach it. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat. The room was dead silent. The air grew heavy, suffocating. Then a whisper. Soft, close. Ethan. His blood turned to ice. It came from behind him. Slowly, painfully slowly, he turned his head. The bedroom door stood open. The shadows inside the room twisted unnaturally, like something was moving within them. His body refused to move. He was trapped. Then his phone vibrated. A new text message. With trembling hands, he lifted the screen to his face. unknown number. Look outside. His stomach twisted. He didn't want to. He shouldn't. But some unseen force compelled him. His steps were slow, hesitant, as he approached the glass balcony door. The night outside was dark, the streetlights below flickering weakly. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then his breath hitched. Sophie was there, standing on the street below his apartment. Her long dark hair hung limply over her face. Her white dress, torn and stained with something dark, swayed slightly in the wind. She wasn't moving. She just stood there, looking up at him. A strangled gasp escaped his lips as his grip tightened on the doorframe. Then she tilted her head, and suddenly she wasn't below anymore. She was on his balcony, standing right in front of him. Ethan staggered back, his chest tightening with pure terror. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to move. Sophie's pale lips parted, and in a whisper that slithered into his bones, she spoke. "You can't escape me." The glass behind her shattered. A powerful force threw Ethan backward. His body hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of his lungs. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the broken balcony door, slow footsteps, approaching. The air grew colder. The lights in the room flickered, then died completely. Darkness swallowed everything. Ethan tried to move, to crawl away, but the moment he did, something grabbed his ankle. A cold, bony hand. His scream was drowned in the night. Chapter 6. Hands from the Dark. A sharp coldness wrapped around Ethan's ankle, paralyzing him with fear. It wasn't the cold of winter or the chill of the wind. It was something unnatural, something dead. He kicked violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the grip only tightened. Then he was dragged. His body slid across the wooden floor, pulled toward the shattered balcony door, toward her. "No, no, let me go!" He clawed at the floor, his fingers scraping against the smooth surface. His nails bent painfully as he desperately tried to stop himself. The shards of broken glass crunched beneath him. A few pieces sliced into his arm, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror burning through his chest. Through the darkness, he saw her. Sophie stood just beyond the broken glass. Her head hung forward, her hair hiding most of her face. Her dress, once white, was now stained with dark, rotting patches. The air around her hummed with something sinister, and then she lifted her head. Ethan's breath hitched. Her face, it wasn't right. Her eyes were completely black, hollow, endless. Her skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tightly over her bones. Her lips twisted into an unnatural smile, revealing jagged blackened teeth. And worst of all, she wasn't alone. The darkness behind her shifted, moved, shapes emerged. Hands, too many hands, reaching out from the shadows, crawling toward him. Some were human, some were not. They grasped at the air, at the floor, at him. Sophie's mouth opened wider than humanly possible. A deep guttural moan rattled from her throat, sending ice-cold dread spiking through Ethan's body. He screamed. With a final desperate surge of strength, Ethan kicked one last time, twisting his body violently. His ankle slipped free. Scrambling to his feet, he ran. His heart pounded as he sprinted through his apartment, his body crashing into furniture in his frantic attempt to escape. The shadows were moving. The air felt thicker, heavier. Behind him, footsteps, slow, steady. He dared not to look back. Throwing himself against the front door, Ethan fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His fingers felt numb, clumsy. The footsteps grew closer. He could feel her behind him. The lights in the hallway beyond the door flickered erratically. The lock finally clicked open. Ethan threw the door wide and stopped cold. The hallway, it wasn't there. Instead of the familiar dimly lit corridor leading to the stairwell, there was nothing, just blackness, a void, endless empty darkness. Cold whispers crawled from within it, seeping into his ears, his skin, his mind. Ethan, there's nowhere left to run. His breath came in shallow gasps. His body trembled violently. He was trapped. Then a hand, ice cold and clawed, gripped his shoulder. Ethan barely had time to scream before the darkness swallowed him whole. Chapter 7. The Other Side Darkness. Endless, suffocating darkness. Ethan's body felt like it was falling. No floor beneath him. No walls. No air. Just an infinite, crushing void pulling him downward. His screams were swallowed by the silence. Then, thud. He hit the ground hard. The impact sent a sharp pain shooting through his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment, he just lay there, dazed and gasping, his fingers clawing at the ground beneath him. It was wet, sticky, cold. The scent of iron filled his nostrils. Ethan's stomach twisted. Blood. He forced himself up on shaky arms, blinking rapidly, trying to see through the thick darkness around him. Shapes began to form. A dim, eerie glow flickered in the distance, casting twisted shadows across the ground. The walls were moving, writhing like they were alive. And then, as his vision cleared, he realized where he was. His bedroom. But it wasn't. The walls were rotting, decayed. The bed was broken, covered in deep claw marks. The windows showed nothing but a vast, empty void. The apartment had become a twisted reflection of itself. A place that was his, but wasn't. A door creaked. Ethan's breath hitched. Slowly he turned his head toward the closet. It was open, and something was inside. A shape, still, watching. His pulse thundered in his ears. His body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. His limbs felt like they were wrapped in invisible chains. Then, it stepped forward. Sophie, or what was left of her. Her head hung at an unnatural angle, as if her neck had been broken. Her arms dangled limply at her sides, fingers twitching. Her skin was grey, peeling, revealing dark, rotting veins underneath. But the worst part, her eyes, black, empty, endless. She smiled. "You took everything from me, Ethan." Her voice was wrong. It was Sophie's, but it wasn't. Layered, distorted, like something else was speaking through her. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. "Sophie, Her head twitched violently. "Don't say my name." The walls trembled. The shadows grew thicker, reaching for him. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He had to wake up. He had to get out. His eyes darted towards the door. It was slightly open. A thin sliver of light bled through the crack. Hope surged through his chest. The exit. He bolted. But Sophie moved faster. 1 second she was across the room. The next, she was right in front of him. A bony hand clamped around his throat. His vision blurred as icy pain shot through his body. Her grip tightened, crushing. Her face was inches from his. He could see the decay, the black veins, the maggots writhing in her torn lips. "You're not leaving me again." Ethan choked, struggled, kicked. His hands clawed at her wrist, but it was like grabbing stone. His vision darkened. His lungs burned. Then, a sound. A knock. It echoed from somewhere beyond the door. Sophie's grip loosened. For the first time, she hesitated. Ethan took his chance. With all the strength he had left, he wrenched himself free and stumbled toward the door. His fingers barely grazed the handle before. A cold hand seized his wrist. Sophie's voice twisted into something inhuman. "You can't escape, Ethan." He turned, panic surging through him, and then the door burst open. Blinding white light flooded the room, and everything vanished. Ethan gasped awake. He was on his bedroom floor, his real bedroom. The apartment was normal again. The walls, the furniture, everything was as it should be. His hands trembled as he touched his throat. No bruises, no marks. Had it all been a dream? A sharp knock startled him. His head snapped towards the front door. He swallowed hard, his body still shaking. Another knock. Slow, deliberate. Then her voice, soft, familiar. "Ethan, let me in." Chapter 8. The door that shouldn't open. The voice on the other side of the door sent a cold chill racing down Ethan's spine. "Ethan, let me in." It was her voice. Sophie, but it couldn't be. His breathing grew shallow as he stared at the door, his mind racing. It was normal, closed, locked, no shadows creeping underneath, no unnatural movements, just a door. And yet, his body screamed at him not to open it. Another knock, slower, heavier. "I know you're awake." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. "This isn't real. It's just in my head." He backed away, his legs weak beneath him. His hands trembled as he grabbed his phone, fumbling to check the time. 11:59 p.m., 1 minute until midnight. The same time the nightmares always began. His heart pounded. He turned his phone over in his hands, debating whether to call someone, anyone. Then, the doorknob turned. Ethan's breath hitched. No. He had locked it. He was sure he had locked it. But the knob twisted anyway. Slowly, deliberately. A soft whispering giggle seeped through the cracks. And then, the door opened. But there was no one there. Just the empty hallway beyond. Ethan stared, his body frozen in pure terror. The hallway light flickered, buzzing faintly. The shadows stretched unnaturally, moving like they were alive. He stepped back. His gut twisted into a painful knot. Then, his phone vibrated. A new text message from an unknown number. "I'm already inside." His breath caught in his throat. The lights in his apartment flickered. A chill spread through the air. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted. And then, from behind him, a whisper. "Turn around." Ethan's blood froze. Every nerve in his body screamed not to move. But something, some unseen force, compelled him. His movements were slow, hesitant. He turned, and then Sophie was there, standing in the middle of his apartment, closer than ever before. Her hair hung in long, wet strands over her face. Her dress was torn, soaked in something dark, and her lips, they stretched into an unnatural, twisted grin. Her empty black eyes bore into him. Ethan's body locked up. He wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't move. Sophie's head tilted slowly, the bones in her neck cracking with the motion. "I told you, you can't escape me." Then, the lights died, and the screaming began. Chapter 9. Drowning in the Dark. The lights died. For a moment there was nothing, just a vast, suffocating darkness. Then, the screaming began. At first Ethan thought it was his own, but the sound was layered, distorted, too many voices at once. It was inside his head. His chest tightened. His breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, paralyzed. Then, a hand gripped his wrist, ice cold, bone thin. Sophie. Even in the dark he could feel her presence. The air around her was wrong, heavy, dense, suffocating. She wasn't just standing near him, she was all around him. A whisper slithered through the blackness. "Do you remember our last night together, Ethan?" The moment she spoke, everything changed. The darkness twisted, shifted. Suddenly, Ethan wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was somewhere else. The air smelled of rain. The distant hum of cars filled the night. And then, he saw it. The cafe. The one where he had broken up with her. But something was wrong. The streetlights flickered like they were about to die. The sky was too dark, like black ink had swallowed the stars. And the cafe itself, it looked abandoned. The windows were shattered. The once warm glow inside was gone, replaced by deep, unnatural shadows. The sign above the entrance flickered violently, the letters barely holding on to their glow. Then, Ethan heard it, the rain. But it wasn't falling from the sky. It was dripping. He looked down. His stomach lurched. The pavement beneath him was soaked in blood. The rain wasn't water. It was thick, dark red. It dripped from the cafe's roof. It poured from the shattered windows. And then, a figure appeared inside, sitting at their old table. Sophie. Her back was turned to him. She sat unnaturally still, her hands folded in her lap. A horrible, sickening dread filled Ethan's chest. He knew what was coming. He remembered this night too well. But before he could move, he was inside. He didn't walk in. He was just there, seated across from her, just like before. His throat went dry. His past self should have been here, not him. Sophie lifted her head, and when she did, Ethan's breath caught. Her face was normal. Her eyes were full of pain, not hatred. This wasn't the ghost. This was the real Sophie. The Sophie he had left behind. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched the scene play out. The last conversation they ever had. "It's not working, Sophie," his own voice said. His stomach twisted. He wanted to scream at himself. To stop. To take it back. I don't understand." Sophie's voice trembled. "Ethan, please. We can fix this." His past self shook his head. "I've already made my choice." Sophie's hands clenched the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned white. Tears welled up in her eyes. "There's someone else, isn't there?" she whispered. The moment she said it, a cold gust of wind ripped through the cafe. Ethan stiffened. Something changed. The walls darkened. The air grew thick with the scent of decay. His past self didn't notice, but Sophie did. Her expression shifted. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking past him. Ethan swallowed hard and turned his head. The windows had gone completely black. No street, no buildings, just darkness. And in that darkness, they were watching dozens of shadowy figures. Their faces were empty, featureless, but their heads were all tilted, staring. Sophie's hands trembled. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. And then, her voice broke. "Ethan, I think something is wrong." Ethan's past self didn't notice, but Ethan did. He remembered now. This wasn't just the night they broke up. This was the night Sophie died. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His stomach churned. He had to stop this. He reached out. Crack. The sound of shattering glass made him freeze. The windows exploded inward. The figures rushed inside. Sophie screamed. Everything collapsed into darkness. Ethan gasped awake. He was back in his apartment, on the floor, shaking. His skin was drenched in sweat. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He looked at his hands. They were covered in blood, not his. And then, a soft, wet whisper, right behind him. "Now do you remember?" Chapter 10. The Truth Beneath the Blood. A whisper, slick and wet, brushed against his ear. "Now do you remember?" Ethan's blood ran cold. His breath hitched as he slowly turned his head. Sophie was right there, too close. Her skin was pale, stretched too thin over her bones. Her long black hair clung to her face like it had been drenched in something thick and dark. But it was her eyes that made his stomach churn. Deep, bottomless pits of blackness. Empty, hollow, and yet somehow they burned with a hatred so intense it felt like they would swallow him whole. Ethan scrambled backward, his body shaking, but Sophie moved with him. She didn't walk. She glided, like something that no longer belonged to this world. "Tell me, Ethan," she whispered, tilting her head unnaturally. "Do you regret it now?" His heart slammed against his chest. Regret. Regret what? The breakup? No. Something deeper. Something worse. His mind flashed back to the vision of the cafe. To the moment the shadowy figures rushed inside. To Sophie's scream. Ethan's breath came out in ragged gasps. He had been so sure that Sophie had died in an accident. But that was a lie. A lie he had told himself. Something inside of him twisted painfully. Suddenly, his apartment shifted. The walls melted into darkness. The air became thick, heavy, suffocating, like he was drowning. And when the world reformed, he was no longer in his apartment. He was back in the past. The real past. Not the memory he had been forcing himself to believe. Not the lie. The truth. The cafe. It was different this time. Not abandoned. Not empty. It was alive. The lights were warm. The scent of coffee filled the air. The gentle hum of music played in the background. And across from him, Sophie was crying. Tears streamed down her face. "I don't understand, Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking. His past self sat there, expressionless, cold. "It's over, Sophie," he said. Ethan felt sick. He could hear the anger, the cruelty in his own voice. His past self stood up. Sophie's hands reached out, desperate, grabbing his wrist. "Please, don't do this," she begged. The cafe door opened. A third person walked inside. Ethan's stomach dropped. A man, Adam, the boy Ethan had fallen for. The reason he had ended things with Sophie. His past self yanked his hand away from Sophie, stepping toward Adam without hesitation. And that was when it happened. Something inside Sophie snapped, her face twisted with pain, anger, and something else, desperation. She stood up suddenly, knocking over her coffee. Her hands trembled violently. "Ethan, please," she sobbed. "Don't leave me for him." Ethan's past self didn't stop, didn't even turn around. That was the moment everything went wrong. Because instead of letting go, Sophie followed him. The scene shifted violently. Now they were outside. It was raining. The streets were empty. And Sophie was still following him. "Ethan, wait!" she cried. "Please, I can't." She grabbed his arm, and something inside Ethan's past self snapped. Hard. He shoved her. Too hard. Too violently. Sophie's eyes widened. She stumbled backward, right into the street. The moment stretched into eternity. The distant glow of headlights. The deafening blare of a car horn. The sound of Sophie's scream. And then, impact. The car slammed into her with a sickening crunch. Her body flipped through the air like a rag doll. She crashed onto the pavement, motionless. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and endless. Ethan's past self stood there, frozen, not moving, not screaming, just watching. And then he turned away, without a word, without looking back, without calling for help. He left her there to die. The memory shattered. Ethan gasped as he was thrown back into the darkness. His body trembled violently. His breath came in broken, ragged gasps. He wanted to deny it. Chapter 11. The Never-Ending Night. Ethan's mind spiraled into chaos. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. His body refused to move, locked in place by the sheer terror of what he had just remembered. He killed her, not with a weapon, not with his hands, but with his cruelty, his indifference, his choice to walk away. And now, Sophie stood right in front of him, a grotesque mockery of the girl he once loved. Her broken body twitched unnaturally, her limbs bending at impossible angles, bones cracked with every subtle movement. Yet her black, empty eyes never left him, never blinked, never wavered. "Say it, Ethan," she whispered. "Say what you did to me." Her voice was thick with something Ethan couldn't describe. Rage, sorrow, vengeance, all twisted into one. His lips trembled. He couldn't speak, because if he said it, if he admitted it, it would make it real. More real than it already was. Sophie took a step closer. The air around her grew heavy, suffocating. The walls of Ethan's apartment melted into darkness once again, swallowed by the same abyss that had consumed his sanity. He tried to step back, but there was nowhere to go. A cold, wet hand grabbed his wrist. Not Sophie's. Something else. Ethan whipped his head around. Shadowy figures. The ones from the cafe. They had returned, but now they were closer, their featureless faces tilted, their empty heads shifting in unison as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Then, they whispered, a chorus of indistinct voices, low, hissing, endless. Ethan's skin crawled. The voices grew louder, sharper, until finally he could make out the words, "Murderer!" Ethan's chest tightened. The whispers swelled, overlapping, growing more violent. Murderer! 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 They weren't just accusing him. They were calling for justice, for vengeance, for his death. Sophie's hand shot forward, gripping his throat. Cold, unrelenting, impossible to fight. Ethan choked, gasping as his vision blurred. His lungs burned, his body convulsed, and through the haze of suffocating darkness, Sophie's voice slithered into his ears. "It's time for you to come with me." Suddenly, a loud bang. The walls shook violently. Sophie's grip loosened just enough for Ethan to stumble backward, collapsing onto the floor, gasping for air. Something was happening. The room flickered. For a brief moment, the apartment returned to normal, and standing in the doorway, Adam. His eyes were wild with terror, his face drenched in sweat. "Ethan! Ethan, are you okay?" Ethan's vision was still spinning, but somehow he managed to nod. Adam didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, grabbing Ethan's arm, but then the entire room turned ice cold. Adam froze, his face contorted in confusion, then fear. He turned his head slowly. Sophie was staring at him now, and for the first time, she spoke his name. Adam. Ethan's stomach dropped. The air shifted. It was no longer just about him. Now she saw Adam too, and she wasn't going to let him leave. Chapter 12. The Last Goodbye. A deep, unnatural silence filled the room. Adam stood frozen, his breath shallow, trembling. Sophie's black, empty eyes locked onto him. Ethan felt his heart slam against his ribs. This wasn't supposed to happen. Sophie wanted him, not Adam. But now, she saw him, and she wouldn't let him go. "Sophie, stop!" Ethan's voice cracked, his body still shaking from her grip. But Sophie didn't even blink. "Why?" she whispered, tilting her head. "You left me for him. Isn't it only fair I take him from you?" Adam stiffened. A shadow flickered behind Sophie. The figures from the cafe. They were everywhere now, in the corners, against the walls, whispering their endless accusations. Ethan forced himself to stand. His body screamed in protest, his mind dizzy with exhaustion. But this was his fault. He couldn't let Adam suffer for it. Not again. He took a shaky step forward. "Sophie, listen to me." Her head snapped toward him. "You don't have to do this." She laughed. The sound was wrong. It was bitter, hollow, full of pain so deep it made Ethan's stomach churn. "Don't have to." Her lips twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl. "You killed me, Ethan. You left me there to die alone. And now, you think you get to tell me what to do?" The room shook violently. The air grew thicker, darker. Adam's breath came out in short gasps. "Ethan," he whispered. He was scared. Ethan swallowed hard. He had to do something, anything. But how do you fight a ghost? How do you stop someone who's already dead? Then, an idea. It was insane, but it was the only chance he had. Ethan took another step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sophie, I remember now." For the first time, she hesitated. The shadows stirred. Ethan forced himself to keep going. "I remember everything. I remember the cafe, the way you cried. I remember the street, the rain. I remember pushing you." The words burned as they left his throat, but it was the truth. And for the first time, Sophie listened. Ethan took a deep breath. "I was a coward. I should have helped you. I should have saved you. Sophie's face twisted. Pain, anger, sadness. Everything all at once. The shadows began to flicker. The whispers grew softer. But Ethan wasn't done. He stepped closer, right in front of her now. And then he did the one thing she never expected. He reached out and touched her hand. Cold. So cold. But Ethan didn't pull away. I'm sorry, Sophie. His voice cracked. I am so sorry. Sophie's entire body shuddered. For a moment, just a moment, she looked like herself again. Not a monster, not a ghost, just a broken girl. Tears welled up in her dark, empty eyes. And then, she let go. The darkness lifted. The shadows vanished. The room shifted back to normal. And Sophie, she was gone. Just like that. Ethan's knees buckled, his body collapsing onto the cold floor. His chest heaved, his hands shaking violently. Adam rushed to him, grabbing his shoulders. Ethan, are you okay? Ethan couldn't answer. He just stared at the empty space where Sophie had been, for the first time in a long time. The apartment was silent. No whispers, no shadows, no Sophie. She was finally at peace, and so was he. Epilogue. A month later, Ethan moved out. He and Adam never spoke about that night. Not really. Some things were better left in the past, but sometimes, late at night, Ethan still felt it. A whisper in the wind, a shadow in the corner of his vision. And sometimes, just sometimes, he swore he could hear her voice, soft, gentle. Goodbye, Ethan. The end.